legal government of the United States is a constitutional republic, not a democracy and not feudalism. But there is an insurgency of Nazis who use the functionality of feudalism in order to get their competitors, such as the Soviet double agents and the Confederates, into compliance with their mutual political trades and black markets. Now, the engagement of this includes the voter fraud, which is the act of the use of surveillance in order to sabotage people, censoring their votes, including the previous research into who they would vote for before they engage it, so that it cannot be a valid, educated vote, at which point the public does not have the capacity to generate a popular government, and because the public isn't the one choosing the politicians, when they ask the politicians and other government agents who they're going to engage with, the functionality is the acts of the illusion through their feudalism, which they want to mislabel as democracy. Now, the engagement of this democracy is necessary to the feudalist arrangements for unlimited government power, which is the opposite of the constitutional republic, the Nazi unlimited sorcery power. Under their democracy does not have these restraints. It has special privileges exceeding into a far more public over a time progression. Now, the acts of terrorism, as is approved of by Bill Barr's unitary executive theory, his theory about the theory, is the permission of the use of these acts of terrorism in order to subsequently change the votes, in which case that's what Donald Trump was complaining about when he complained about voter fraud, but at the same time it was being protected by William Barr or whoever else would have been compliant with the insurrection, which is the act of terrorism against the general public for the sedition of preventing the legal vote from being processed correctly. Now, the engagement from the protections of those picked for the voter fraud generates an exception under the specific pretense of how they want to change the vote, which is different than having not changed the vote, which is the general misunderstanding of their play on words in their con. Now, the engagement of their con facilitates our separate government. This separate government is not the legal government of the United States. It's not the constitutional republic. It is the feudalist Nazis. Now, the feudalist Nazis are not Americans, and don't let them fool you. Those white nationalists do not have any loyalties to this country. And it doesn't matter what side the insurgents are on. It's not Democrat or Republic. It's America versus feudalism. The insurgents will compromise the Democratic Party, will compromise the Republican Party, and have no loyalties to either because they are at war with the country. The act of refusing national security by the United States military is the express position that they are utterly worthless to the Americans, but completely viable to the feudalist Nazis, who constantly hire them for their illegal wars while actively getting them to not do anything, and in fact punish them for supporting the United States against the feudalists. Whenever they report against the Nazis, they get punished, and whenever they support the United States Constitution under their oath of office, qualifying their access to their government agency as an agent of the government under the nation, they then become the enemy of the Nazis. But if they oppose that office in favor of the Nazis, they get promoted by the insurgency, which is neither Republican nor Democrat, and it's not democracy, and it's not a republic. It's feudalism. They're Nazis. Put them to death. If California's Civil War was based on reasonable force in order to win, they would have subcontracted to the character for David Boles, sending their talents and their business opportunities to him in order to facilitate the normal advantage of lobbying. Now, the engagement of the normal advantage of lobbying, from the estimate that they would have already had from the character and the wizard courts from the military intelligence, would have qualified their engagement to have satisfied an extremely high and affably desirable human decency. The high engagement of these contracts and the returns from these contracts would have been mutually beneficial, and thus reasonable force would dictate that that would be the most desirable position, because that would be the one with the most returns. Now, the engagement of the highest returns at the necessary force in order to gain the advantage of what is from the status quo lobbying, which is this normal engagement of the political influence and alliances to facilitate their cooperation with what is not limited to non-competition in particular agreements, such as their act of treason through civil war. Now, their engagement of treason through civil war could have made their lobbying position for David to not fight them on it beyond what he is obligated to under particular contracts such as national security, where he might be compelled to condemn them publicly, where he wanted to actually have to use any violence against them, which would have been necessary force in order to win. Depending upon what are the other contracts they would be able to negotiate to their position. Now, since this is the most desirable position, that would be necessary force in order to win, but necessary force in order to win isn't their actual objective. Their actual objective is the act of destruction of the United States by the destabilizing of the American public and overthrow of their government. Now, the engagement of doing this facilitates the position where they subcontract the hate crimes, such as the racism against the character for David Boles' culture. Now, the engagement of eradication through genocide of this culture allows them the advantages from their racists and their fetishes of the racists to not have challenges to the rape culture and other active pursuits that they would have been cultivating for a long time. Now, the engagement of cultivation of these non-competitions, again, are different policies, but still lobbying issues. Now, the engagement of the lobbying issues proves this isn't necessary force in order to win, because otherwise they would have mutually benefited from a higher human decency, paid for more revenue. The use of terrorism to advance their position by the reduction of status, by the subversion of contracts, is the criminal act of the reduction of status, which cannot legally be done without an actual claim to the qualifier of the use of force, which cannot be condoned in these particular situations, such as with mine on the basis of the legal character for David Boles, which they are using in their secret wizard courts to express the strategy on how to defeat myself in the United States by the targeting of the elite, by the Mongolian war strategy, which is the targeting of the elite in order to scatter the less viably stable. Now, this position allows malicious coercion and censorship. Now, the act of the malicious censorship, for example, might be the position to have prevented myself or others to make videos or write letters or other things which are perfectly legal and benign at the correct viable position where it meant something, such as writing a letter to a senator preceding a functionally important bill. Now, this censorship prevents the engagements, which reduces the confidence in whatever position the letter was supposed to be heading, at which point the senator in question would not condone one way or another on the basis of the censored material and operate as normal under the coercion of the censorship, preventing them from the representation of the public through the letter, which would express their legal obligation to represent the public in the policies in question that they would be negotiating. Now, this activity is the subversion of a legal function, which is an act of sedition, and that act of sedition in these terrorist attempts is in alignment with the quote from George W. Bush in the War on Terror that all who support terrorists are an enemy of the United States in the War on Terror. Black sites, executions, assassinations, these are all viable options to use against the terrorists in question, using these engagements, such as the double agents responsible for the censorship and coercion in terrorist attacks under the claim of a false title such as secrecy or a secular civil war, which has been leveraged before it falsely passed and long after it has already been established as a false precedent normally acted upon. Now, that false precedent normally acted upon wouldn't be necessary any further because it's supposed to have been passed, but they know that it's a false policy and therefore didn't actually pass, and thus the inversion of the engagement of these cases of human trafficking and others would remove it by the virtue of its own internal unstable nature. By ex post facto not being legal, they can't refuse to remove it on the basis of those terrorist attacks, making them terrorist attacks by the white nationalists who are actively seeking the injury, which have to pay all of the debts, including the acts of criminal treason by those such as David's character, who they targeted under the assumption of starting a nation which would have had a treaty with the United States disbarring them from this engagement. Now, this high crime of attacking an allied nation is to be punished with death according to the treaties that they assumed. Now, the engagement of them forfeiting to David's country requires the full payment of all of their debts, including the active threats to his country, which are to be executed. Now, the engagement of the execution of these terrorists, which we will never refuse or would actively rebuff any attempt to not endanger or injure David's country on the engagement of their racism, such as the subversion of his social engagements from the character's position. Now, that eradication from the history of his entire country and society and culture is by definition genocide, which they are to be fully punished for as the insurrectionist cunts they are. The insurrectionist position against substantive due process is a claim on the basis that the judiciary doesn't have a right to write laws, but since the legislative is being subverted in its natural state by its sabotage of the naturally preventing the function of the American government, because the acts of terrorism in economic terrorism and others from the higher terrorists, such as the economic hitmen hired by the groups in the government, such as Lindsey Graham's condoning of the engagement of economic terrorism in order to facilitate other coercive compliance, such as political facilitation to the disposition of whatever they are expressing, which is fully arbitrary in nature, which is the expressed threat to anything that has historically been injured, to reinforce the social norms of the white nationalists through whatever con they need to do, primarily covering for the coercion. So the cover protects the coercion, and the coercion reinforces the historic crime that they would need to cover for. So they need to relent to a certain quantity of things normally not approved of by the white nationalist insurrectionists, because the exchange has engaged to that extreme position. The normal terrorist activities, such as the violation of life, which is human decency to the point of existence. Now, the act of terrorism against someone, such as with the position of human trafficking, is designed to diminish them beneath the viable living conditions for the targeted individual, who, being suppressed below their tolerable living conditions, would view it as normally unlivable in a state of nature without the use of the coercion, at which point the expressed position moves to the liberty question, and the liberty question is self-determination, and the self-determination by the use of government being manipulated by the Satan cult requires the terrorists to attack in order to be gun established by the government for the express position of rewards and punishments on the basis of the conformity to their universal morality, such as, but is not limited to, Sam Harris's universal morality, which is a false claim by people who haven't thought about it and never plan on doing it. It is an illusion to cover for the offenses in question, such as the central planners of the Nazis, who are their king, hail Hitler, or die is their functional position. Whenever you engage in these acts, the development of the insurrection doesn't start at the finish line, it starts at the start. Kill them or die. Coercion, such as in the position for rape, requires the ability for the person being engaged against to have not consented to the action. Now, for the women who support the rape culture, they've default already consented and therefore cannot potentially be raped by definition. And those who support J. Sekulow's civil war against the United States, which is an underling feudalist coup against the United States, whose king are the Nazis, are on the subject of coercion on all matters, including the hate crime matters, which is political, sexual, and others, and the sexual orientation being approved of being by the manipulation as a government concern by their consenting facilitation is consent to the engagement of the use of coercion on the use of sexual exchanges, such as, but is not limited to, the active manipulation of the sexual market by the government hiring terrorists to use espionage against the sexual market for women and others, limiting their action, such as the freedom of association being violated and artificial isolation specifically curtailed to engage in the elevation of the person that the rapist chose, which is the definition of rape culture. Their active protection of each other, such as through the military, law enforcement, and others. Some cite in the military, such as Duvall, who actively found that the rape culture is extremely prevalent in straight white men who don't have a lot of sexual options, who randomly have the new ingestion of attractive athletic women. Now, since that absolute mystery has been solved, the engagement of certain things such as the draft for women is easier to understand, because then you have the engagement of their subjugation to the office in the military, allowing them the normal conformity of being censored into compliance to the position where they would be insubordinate if they opposed the sexual advances, which might have been defined by some others as rape. These criminal policies have engaged in active crimes, which currently there are many covers for, such as the cancel culture, or the being overly ridiculous when the various people are engaged in the acquiring of office for politics or judiciary or other government positions, such as with the Kavanaugh arrangement, which was an intentional distraction show, which was covering for their malicious crimes, which neither side wanted to take seriously. Not wanting to take it seriously, they actively saw the naturally chosen by the public, and they engaged in their war crimes against us. And in doing so, neither side, even in the arrangements of being subject to the ridiculous conditions, was willing to assist the actual justification which was the removing of the natural elite chosen by the public without obstructions, qualifying the aggression and the censorship, which is why the show tunes escapades had been going on with the political theater, such as the being overly aggressive against Trump had been engaged in, despite the fact that many of the times that they were doing it, it would be clearly ridiculous on the basis of him telling the truth and then calling him a liar on many of the issues, which is the functional subject of muddying the water. Now, they never took that seriously. It was a collaboration. Both sides had accepted being a part of the same insurgency. They were unwilling to support the legal American answer in favor of the insurrectionist answer, which is what the entire political theater was based off of. For the aggressive left is ridiculous, the right is ridiculous arrangements